Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. The rain that afternoon came slowly, like someone reluctant to cry. It started with a whisper on the roof of the modest wooden house at the end of Mabira Lane, then fell into a gentle rhythm, as though heaven itself were thinking deeply. Inside that small home, Amanda Ogbonna moved quietly, almost in step with the pattering drops outside. She wasn't one for noise or spectacle. Even her footsteps seemed to apologize for disturbing the silence. Her hands, graceful but worn from years of careful giving, folded the last piece of freshly washed clothing with the kind of attention most people reserved for sacred things. A pale blue shirt ironed earlier that morning carried the scent of soap and eucalyptus. It was Joshua's, his favorite, the one he wore whenever he had an interview. She pressed it gently, smoothing the sleeves, as though her touch could also smooth the nerves that would surely visit him in the hours to come. Amanda had lived in the town of Havila her whole life. Havala wasn't famous, nor was it grand. The streets had no billboards, no glass towers, no noisy malls. It was the sort of place where people still remembered your birthday without needing a calendar, and where time moved slowly enough for sunsets to be noticed. Yet within the quiet routines of the town, Amanda's world had revolved around a single man for nearly half a decade. She was 27 now, and every year of the past 5 had been spent building, lifting, praying, waiting. Waiting for something she couldn't quite name, though she told herself it was love. She told herself it was hope, but more often than not, it was just Joshua. Their story had started simply enough. They met during their university years at the nearby Northmore College, Amanda studying sociology, Joshua mechanical engineering. She remembered the first time she saw him, standing in the library aisle with a pile of textbooks, frowning as if the words on the pages had personally offended him. He had looked up, smiled sheepishly, and said, "I think I'm losing this battle." That was Joshua, charming, a bit dramatic, full of wild dreams and quick laughter. Amanda, in contrast, was quiet, deliberate. She didn't chase dreams, she nurtured them. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. Somehow, the two had found each other in the middle of their differences, as though opposites didn't just attract, they completed. Those early days had been soft and bright, like morning sun filtering through lace curtains. Amanda remembered the long walks on red sand roads, the smell of roasted corn from roadside stalls, the feel of Joshua's calloused hand wrapped around hers. He spoke often of his plans to build engines, to travel the world, to make his mother proud. Amanda never doubted him. In her journal, she once wrote, "Joshua sees the world as a mountain to climb. I want to be the soil under his feet, steady, firm, quiet." And she meant it. What she didn't realize then was that soil, though necessary, is rarely noticed. You plant dreams in it, walk over it, build on it, but seldom do you stop to thank it. Amanda's love for Joshua had always taken the shape of service. When his father passed away, she was the one who brought warm food to his home for weeks, who helped his mother sort through documents, who walked his younger sister to school. She gave what she had, not just money, but time, presence, prayers. She bought him textbooks when his scholarship couldn't cover them. She stayed up with him during sleepless nights of exam prep, even when she had tests of her own. She prayed for him without being asked, and sometimes she even fasted, asking God to open doors for him. Her love wasn't loud, it wasn't demanding. It was a quiet, ever-present offering given freely. Yet, somewhere along the way, Amanda began to feel like a background character in the story of a man she was helping to shape. Joshua was always the center, the dreamer, the speaker, the one with the plans. She listened, encouraged, supported, but rarely did he ask her what she wanted, what she dreamed of. On the rare occasions he did, and she tried to speak, his eyes would drift, his phone would buzz, his mind would wander. Amanda had learned to keep her wants tucked neatly in the pages of her journal. Small hopes like starting a tailoring business or visiting the old coastal city her grandmother used to talk about. Simple things. But even simple things, when ignored long enough, begin to feel like luxury. That evening, with the rain dancing on the roof and the folded shirt in her hands, Amanda paused. She looked out the window at the grey sky, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. There was something in her eyes, something between faith and fatigue. She whispered a prayer, not too loud, not too desperate. Lord, if this is the path I must walk, give me the strength to keep walking. She didn't ask for more love. She didn't ask for Joshua to notice her more. Just strength. Because Amanda knew that love alone, no matter how pure, wasn't enough to build a life. There had to be balance. And as much as she gave, she was starting to feel the emptiness grow, like a well whose water was slowly being drawn without ever being replenished. The sound of shoes clicking on pavement echoed in Amanda's ears like distant thunder, a reminder of how far the world around her had moved while she remained rooted in place. Weeks had passed since Joshua received the offer from the firm in Westford, a sprawling city of noise, movement, and endless pursuit. Amanda had helped him craft the application with the same patience she once used to sew her late grandmother's torn garments. She'd sat beside him through late nights of edits and corrections, occasionally offering tea when his eyes grew tired. When the email finally came, Joshua had paced the floor like a man on fire, eyes alight, laughter spilling out of him like a boy discovering the sea for the first time. Amanda had laughed too, but it was softer, steadier, less from surprise, more from the quiet joy of seeing hard work bloom. She didn't cry when he hugged her, but her hands trembled ever so slightly. She had prayed for this, she had fasted for it. And yet, when he began to speak about relocating, about training, about the opportunities ahead, Amanda felt a sudden stillness inside her, as if something was watching from a distance, waiting to see what she would do with the absence he had not yet acknowledged. Joshua had changed not all at once, but in shifts so subtle they were easy to ignore if one wasn't looking closely. He no longer lingered after prayers, no longer waited for Amanda to finish her sentences. When he called, his voice was full of excitement but also full of interruptions. Amanda found herself repeating phrases like, "Are you there? And I can call back later." And though he always said no, she knew he wasn't really present. One evening, while folding her linen skirts and tidying up the living room, she stumbled across a handwritten letter she had begun to write him but never sent. It started with, "I miss who we were before ambition taught us to overlook the people who helped us dream." She stared at the page, then carefully tore it in half. Her heart still rooted for him, but her spirit had started to retreat, like a tide unsure if the shore it once kissed would welcome it back. Joshua's new world in Westford seemed to be expanding faster than hers could keep up with. And Amanda, still in her villa, still waking before dawn to say prayers on his behalf, began to notice how invisible one could feel even while giving everything. The invitation to visit came unexpectedly. Joshua called one morning, his voice lighter than usual, asking if Amanda could come for a few days. "I want you to see the city," he said. "There's so much to show you." Her heart leapt. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine long walks on clean sidewalks, laughter over steaming bowls of food, whispered plans under city lights. She packed with care, choosing the green dress Joshua once said made her look like springtime. Her mother kissed her goodbye, telling her to be safe and to watch people's eyes. They tell more truth than their mouths. The journey to Westford was long but not unbearable. Amanda sat by the window, watching towns pass like pages in a book. When she finally arrived and stood outside the apartment building, suitcase in hand, her breath caught in her throat. The city was loud. The people moved with purpose, no one smiling unless they had to. Amanda was not afraid, but she was suddenly aware of how small her presence felt in this giant place built of steel and speed. Joshua opened the door with a distracted smile. His apartment smelled of aftershave and Chinese takeout. It was neat, modern, efficient, nothing like the cluttered charm of the house they once sat in back in Havila, poring over his future. He hugged her, brief and polite, and then returned to his laptop. The days that followed blurred into awkward silences and lukewarm conversations. He took calls during meals, replied to texts with quick smirks, and only occasionally looked at Amanda the way he used to. She noticed how his voice changed when he spoke to others, louder, more assertive, sprinkled with phrases he never used before. One night, as they sat side by side on his sleek grey couch, he turned to her and said, almost carelessly, "You know, Amanda, I think we've outgrown each other. You're a good person, but you're too serious. Too simple." The words hung in the air like smoke. Amanda didn't cry. She just looked at him long and hard until he looked away. She picked up her things, walked out into the cool night air, and kept walking until the ache in her chest matched the soreness in her feet. There were no raised voices, no slamming doors. Just silence, as if the world itself had paused to witness the quiet end of something once full of hope. The following morning in Westford was drenched in sunlight, but Amanda felt no warmth. She sat by the window in a small bus terminal, her suitcase beside her, untouched since the night before. She had slept in a nearby guest house, barely slept, really. The pillow had held her tears like an old friend, and the ceiling above her offered no answers, only stillness. The city buzzed beyond the glass, cars weaving in and out like threads in a chaotic tapestry, but Amanda remained still. She clutched her Bible, not tightly, but gently, like something familiar, something real in a world that had suddenly lost all color. The verse that found her that morning was Isaiah 43 verse 2. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Not if, but when." She read it over and over, letting the words soak into her like rain into dry ground. The pain hadn't fully settled yet. It hadn't named itself, but it hovered dense, waiting. Joshua hadn't even walked her to the gate. He had simply closed the door after she left, as if she were a delivery that had been received and no longer needed. That memory pressed against her chest like a stone. It wasn't the cruelty of loud rejection that hurt the most, it was the casual, almost effortless dismissal. She wasn't cast aside in rage. She was simply forgotten, quietly, like a misplaced object in a room that had been redecorated. Amanda returned to her villa on a Thursday, a town still unchanged by the speed of the outside world. The streets looked the same, the air still smelled faintly of burning wood, and the old women still gossiped near the market stalls with wide fans in their hands. But something within Amanda had shifted. Her steps were slower, her eyes more distant. When her mother opened the door and saw her daughter's forced smile, she said nothing. She simply held her, the way mothers do when they sense that words will not carry what the arms can. Amanda didn't speak much that evening. She helped prepare dinner, braided her little cousin's hair, and later sat alone by the corridor as the moonlight poured down gently across the stone floor. She found herself humming a hymn, one she hadn't heard in years. "What a friend we have in Jesus." The tune was fragile, barely there, but it rose and fell like a quiet prayer. That night, in the solitude of her room, Amanda cried not the loud, desperate cries of betrayal, but the soft weeping of someone who had been emptied. She felt foolish for having hoped, foolish for having built a future on words never followed by action. But beyond the ache, deeper than the humiliation, there was a whisper, a still small voice reminding her, this is not the end. The days that followed were slow and uncertain. Amanda moved like someone caught between two realities, the life she had built around another's dream and the unfamiliar quiet that remained after its collapse. Friends came by with concerned eyes and gentle questions, but she offered little. Not out of pride, but because she wasn't yet ready to relive it through words. The house was too familiar, too full of memories she now wanted to forget. She stopped answering calls that began with, "Have you heard from him?" and politely declined invitations that involved public gatherings. Her world had grown smaller, not out of fear but necessity. She needed silence, she needed space. It was during those silent days that Amanda returned to her journal, the one she had long since tucked away. The pages still held bits of her old self, poems, prayers, little hopes scribbled in pencil. She didn't write about Joshua. Instead, she wrote about stillness, about starting again, about asking God who she was outside of anyone else's shadow. Prayer no longer came as easily. Some days she simply sat on her bed and stared out the window, waiting for the courage to speak again. But even then, she knew God was not absent in her silence. He was sitting with her in it. As the weeks turned into a quiet stretch of months, Amanda began to see herself in ways she hadn't before. There were no lightning bolts, no grand revelations, just small moments of clarity. She started tending her grandmother's old sewing machine, a rusted but sturdy piece of iron she had almost thrown out years ago. With hesitant fingers she relearned the rhythm, the way the foot pedal groaned beneath her heel, the hum of the needle tracing cloth like a whisper. She made napkins first, then cushion covers, slowly, deliberately. Her hands remembered even when her heart did not. Neighbors began to ask, "Can you help fix this hem?" Or "Can you make something like this?" And she said yes, not out of ambition, but because her soul needed the work. It was therapy, not business. And yet each stitch became a thread pulling her back to herself. She prayed again, not for a man, not for a relationship, but for strength, for restoration. She would whisper into the night, "Lord, make me whole again." Not like before, but new. Her healing was not loud. It was not made for show, but it was steady. And each morning as she rose with the dawn, Amanda began to understand that being left behind did not mean being abandoned. Sometimes it meant being set aside for something greater, something sacred, something meant only for her. Amanda's mornings took on a new rhythm, slower, quieter, but rich with intention. She would rise before the sun crested over the distant hills, not out of obligation, but out of desire. Her sleep, once restless and punctuated by unspoken questions, had grown gentler. As dawn broke, she often sat by her window with a steaming cup of tea, wrapped in an old wool shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and eucalyptus. The world outside was always still then, the kind of stillness that seemed to carry whispers. Amanda no longer rushed into her day. She began each morning with a moment of surrender, sometimes a prayer, other times a silent gaze at the sky, where pink clouds drifted like softened promises. The ache inside her hadn't vanished entirely, but it had dulled into something bearable, something she could carry without crumbling beneath it. In that quiet, she slowly began to ask herself questions she had never dared voice. Who am I without Joshua? What do I want that isn't tied to someone else's vision? The answers didn't come all at once, but the courage to ask was enough. And little by little, she felt her identity unfold, not as someone's partner, not as someone's support, but as someone in her own right. The sewing machine, once tucked away in a dusty corner, had now claimed a space of honor in Amanda's small living room. It sat beside the window, catching the sunlight like a loyal companion. Amanda had learned to trust her hands again. Each stitch felt like an act of defiance against the silence Joshua had left behind. She no longer made clothes as a favor or to pass the time. Now it was something more, an offering, a declaration that she was still here, still breathing, still building. She started with fabric scraps she had stored years ago, forgotten under her bed. From them she fashioned simple linen dresses, aprons and wraps, things people could use. The first few she gave away shyly to women in her church and elderly neighbors. Their gratitude, unforced and genuine, wrapped around her like a balm. Word of her skill spread without her trying. Before long, people began to knock gently on her door, asking if she could sew for birthdays, christenings, or just because. Amanda accepted each request with humility, not because she needed approval, but because it gave her purpose. The coins they pressed into her palm were welcome but not necessary. She was not sewing for profit. She was stitching herself back together, one garment at a time. Her prayers took a new shape. They no longer sounded like begging, no longer wavered with desperation. They were simple, direct, honest. She didn't pray for Joshua to return. That chapter, once swollen with longing, had been closed quietly one afternoon as she sat at her sewing table, watching a thread snap mid-stitch. She remembered staring at the frayed thread and realizing that some things don't tear. They unravel slowly, strand by strand, until all that's left is silence. From that day, her prayers became conversations. "Lord," she would whisper as she pressed fabric beneath the needle, "teach me to love myself without permission." Other days she'd say nothing at all, simply humming hymns as her hands worked. One Sunday after church service, she sat beneath the jacaranda tree near the compound wall and opened her Bible, letting her fingers fall where they may. The verse that greeted her was Joel 2:25. "I will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten." She read it aloud again and again, as though speaking it could quicken the bones within her. Amanda believed it, not because she saw immediate changes, but because restoration, like healing, often begins in unseen places. She had poured 5 years into a man who didn't see her, but God had seen every sacrifice, every prayer, every tear. And now, in this quiet season, she trusted that nothing had been wasted. By the time the year waned into its final quarter, Amanda had found a rhythm so natural it surprised her. She smiled more now, not the half smiles she used to give to reassure others, but full ones, rising from the inside like birds taking flight. Her business had grown modestly. She now had a corner in the Saturday market where she displayed her work beneath a canopy of canvas and prayer. Children often stopped by to touch the fabrics, fascinated by the colors and textures, and Amanda always greeted them with warmth. Her customers were loyal, not just because of her skill, but because of the kindness she laced into every interaction. There was no bitterness in her, no shadow of Joshua in her tone. If anyone brought him up, she would gently steer the conversation elsewhere. Not out of avoidance, but because her story had moved on. She had forgiven him quietly, not because he asked, but because her soul needed the space to breathe. Forgiveness was not forgetting. It was choosing to carry peace instead of poison. And as the wind swept gently through the marketplace, stirring the corners of her linen tablecloths, Amanda stood with both feet planted, no longer waiting, no longer hoping for someone to return. She had returned to herself, and that was enough. The return of Joshua Lawson to Nive came not with fanfare, nor with the wind of success at his back, but with the quiet shuffle of a man whose shoes no longer fit the path he thought he had paved. He arrived just as the rains began to soften the soil, the roads glistening under grey skies, and the town breathing its usual rhythm of calm. No one had seen him in over 2 years, and the ones who did now whispered rather than spoke aloud. There was something unfamiliar about him, not in his face, which still held the handsomeness he once wore so proudly, but in the way he moved, shoulders slightly bent, eyes slower to meet others. The same man who once walked into rooms with a voice full of conviction now waited for doors to open first. He wasn't just older, he was quieter, thinner, and wrapped in the scent of regret. The job that had swept him away to Westford had ended in scandal, a collapse that stained his resume and his pride. His circle of friends had dwindled as quickly as it had grown. And the woman he had chosen over Amanda? She had vanished long before his final paycheck. He returned with a small bag, no job, and too many thoughts that kept him from sleeping well. Joshua passed Amanda's tailoring store one morning without intending to. He had taken the longer route from the market, hoping to avoid familiar faces, but the layout of Nive hadn't changed. As he walked past her small canopy shaded by canvas and branches, he slowed. She stood behind her wooden table, folding a cream-colored dress with a grace that made him pause. For a moment he considered turning back, but something inside him held him still, some stubborn remnant of hope or guilt, or both. Amanda looked different, though it wasn't her clothes or her hairstyle. It was something in the way she stood. There was strength in her posture, a quiet assurance in her eyes that made it clear she had been through something and came out whole. She hadn't seen him yet. He watched as she greeted a customer, her smile wide and full, not the hesitant kindness he remembered, but something radiant, like the joy of someone who had survived the storm and learned to dance in the rain. When she finally caught his gaze, her expression did not change. She looked at him the way one might look at a distant memory, familiar, but no longer necessary. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Later that week, Joshua gathered the nerve to visit her. He knocked on the door of her mother's house, unsure if she still lived there. Amanda answered, dressed in a soft blue wrapper, her face free of makeup, her eyes calm. There was a long silence between them, too many unspoken things crowding the space. Joshua's words came slowly, like a man walking barefoot on broken glass. He apologized, not with grand gestures or rehearsed speeches, but in fragments. I didn't see clearly. I thought I wanted more. I was wrong. Amanda listened, not interrupting, not rushing. She stood still, her arms crossed loosely, her gaze steady. When he finished, there was another silence. Then she spoke, not angrily, not emotionally, but with a depth that stopped him mid-thought. "Joshua," she said softly, "I was never too good for you. You just didn't know what good looked like." Her words were not a weapon, they were a mirror. Joshua felt the weight of them settle in his chest, heavier than any insult could have been. He reached for her hand instinctively, but she didn't offer it. "I'm not angry," she continued, "and I've forgiven you, but I'm not yours to find anymore. That season has passed." He nodded, not because he understood fully, but because he knew he had no right to argue. He left with his apology accepted, but nothing reclaimed. In the days that followed, Joshua lingered in Neva, trying to piece his life back together. Some said he was humbled, others said he was broken, but Amanda no longer spent her thoughts on his story. She had closed that chapter fully, not by burning the pages, but by writing new ones. Occasionally she would see him in the market or at a church program, standing in the back, quieter than before. He no longer looked at her with expectation, only with a kind of wistful respect. Amanda had no bitterness in her. She prayed for him from time to time, not for reconciliation, but for healing. The kind of healing she had walked through, slow, honest, and sacred. When women in her fellowship asked her to speak on forgiveness, she never mentioned his name. She didn't need to. Her peace spoke louder than any detail could. And every time she stood before them, sharing her journey, not as a victim, but as a testimony, her voice carried some that could only come from the fire. Not everyone who leaves deserves to return, and not every return is meant for reunion. Amanda had learned that God doesn't always restore by returning what was lost. Sometimes He replaces it with something better. And that was the beginning of something new. The months that followed passed not in dramatic turns, but in gentle, intentional steps. Amanda's days were full but not rushed. She moved with the grace of someone who had made peace with time. Her tailoring business had grown beyond the stall at the Saturday market. Now orders came from neighboring towns, and occasionally someone sent a request through a friend of a friend, simply asking for the woman who sews with soul. Amanda never advertised. She didn't need to. Her work spoke for itself, not only through its quality, but through the tenderness it carried. Every dress she made felt like a story stitched in fabric, a quiet reminder that beauty could be born even from pain. She worked under the shade of the guava tree in her backyard when the weather allowed, the scent of ripening fruit mingling with the hum of her machine. Children often played nearby, their laughter drifting into her workspace like music. Amanda welcomed the sound. It reminded her that life continued with or without permission. What she once thought was the end of her story had instead become the soil for something unexpected. Each passing day confirmed what her spirit already knew. Restoration doesn't always come wrapped in the same form it left. Sometimes it arrives gently, through joy not loud but steady. In the quiet hours of her evenings, Amanda often sat beneath the open sky, watching as dusk painted the world in shades of gold and violet. These were the moments when her soul exhaled. Sometimes she would close her eyes and let the breeze touch her face, imagining it carried all the words she had never said, all the questions she had released without needing answers. The wound Joshua left behind had healed, not into a scar that made her flinch, but into a mark of survival, proof that she had walked through the fire and emerged whole. She never sought out love again in the desperate way that people sometimes do when they want to prove they're not broken. Instead, she waited, not passively but with trust. One evening, after a small community program where she had spoken about rebuilding one's life after betrayal, she noticed a man named Nathan lingering near the churchyard. He was soft-spoken, kind-eyed, a widower who had moved back to care for his aging mother. There was nothing flashy about him, no grand entrance, no sweeping gestures, but there was warmth. He asked her if she would show him how to make lemon tea the way her grandmother had once taught at a gathering. She laughed, surprised at the request, but agreed. What followed was not a whirlwind romance. It was a quiet unfolding, like watching morning dew disappear under sunlight. Amanda wasn't trying to be loved anymore. She was simply learning to be seen. Their conversations were long but unhurried. They spoke of small things at first, gardening, shared recipes, books they had read years ago and still remembered. But slowly, like a stream carving through rock, they delved deeper. Nathan never asked about her past, not at first. And when she did tell him one afternoon over yam porridge and chilled zobo, he listened without interruption, without judgment. When she finished, he said simply, "That was never your fault. You were just ahead of someone who didn't know how to catch up. Amanda didn't cry, but something inside her shifted. It was the kind of validation she hadn't known she needed until she heard it. Nathan didn't try to fill the gaps or promise her a future dipped in gold. He merely offered presence. And that, Amanda realized, was more precious than any grand plan. In time, they began walking together, not as people desperate to escape loneliness, but as individuals who had learned to enjoy their own company first. With him, Amanda felt no pressure to shrink, no need to perform. And perhaps that was the sweetest part. She was loved not because she'd been broken, but because she had chosen to heal. On the day Amanda and Nathan decided to commit to each other publicly, not through a lavish wedding, but a simple church blessing under the old fig tree near her mother's house, Amanda wore a dress she had sewn herself. It was soft lavender, a color her late grandmother once said looked like joy and quiet strength combined. The small gathering was filled with friends who had walked with her through her dark hours, women who had prayed alongside her, neighbors who had watched her rise again piece by piece. Her mother wept not from sorrow but from pride, the kind that comes from seeing your child refuse to be swallowed by pain. As Amanda stood beside Nathan, holding his hand beneath the woven arch of wildflowers, she didn't feel like someone who had finally found her happy ending. She felt like someone who had learned to write her own beginning. And when she looked out into the crowd, she saw faces smiling, not just at her, but with her. Not everyone in the world who loses something is given back something better. But Amanda had discovered a deeper truth. Even when what you prayed for walks away, God will never leave you with empty hands. Sometimes He gives you back yourself first, stronger, wiser, and finally ready to be loved as you are. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.